Hello everyone and welcome to this debate on how Denmark can take responsibility for the LGBT plus refugees around the world. The debate is arranged by LGBT Asylum. My name is Sarah Christine Johansen. I'm a senior advocacy advisor at Global Focus, working on climate change, so something completely different, but though still working with world issues, you could say. I have the pleasure of facilitating today's exciting debate. And first of all, why is this topic even relevant, you might ask yourself? Well, within the last couple of years, I would say LGBT Asylum has received quite many inquiries from LGBTI plus people on refugees around the world who are seeking asylum or are refugees in countries next to or close to their country of origin, what we in Denmark sometimes used to call nærområderne. And they have fled due to their sexuality and or their gender identity. And their stories and cries for help point to one thing, that LGBTI plus refugees are not safe in the neighboring areas of the countries to which they have fled either. As one of them has stated, there simply isn't any safe option. So what is the responsibility of Denmark in this matter? And how can we protect LGBTI plus refugees? Is quota refugees a solution? And what else can we do? These are some of the questions we would address in this debate today. Thus, allow me to introduce our panel, which will provide us both with insights and solutions, I hope. First of all, we have Helle Jacobsen, Program Manager and for Gender, Women and LGBTI Rights in Amnesty International Denmark. We have Mads Tedrud Jensen, Board Member and Spokesperson in LGBT Asylum. We have Anna Berg, LGBTQ and Gender Equality Policy Advisor for the Red Green Alliance. Yes. And we have Astrid Aller, Member of Copenhagen City Council for the Socialist People's Party. Welcome everyone. So we will start with a round of introductory remarks from the panelists, and then we will open up the floor and online for questions. First, Helle, will you give us an overview of the current situation for LGBTI plus refugees around the world and what type of persecutions they flee from? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting Amnesty to be part of this really important panel. So Amnesty is a big human rights organization, and some of the things that we do globally is to document human rights violations and abuses. And that's also what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, some of the things we have documented and some of the trends that we see globally at the moment when it comes to LGBTI plus persons. So, as always, there is both progress and backlashes when it comes to this important topic. But in a lot of places in the world, including Europe, I know you cannot seek asylum from an EU country to Denmark, but I'm still going to talk a little bit about Europe because we see some very worrying trends when it comes to LGBTI people within Europe. But as we speak today, there is still more than 65 countries in the world that in one way or the other criminalizes LGBTI plus persons' identity or relationships. Still 8 countries hold the death penalty for being LGBTI plus person. We see discrimination, persecution and violence in all parts of the world, including Europe. We have also seen some countries in the recent years decriminalize homosexuality. But here Amnesty's documentation shows that, of course, a law carries culture, but it takes decades to change attitudes within a population. So I will just give a few examples from different countries from the trends that we are seeing, but that doesn't mean that these are the only countries who have these problems or violations. For example, in 2009, Angola decriminalized homosexuality. after a lot of debate and a lot of pressure from civil society, including LGBTI plus organizations. But still, up until today, Amnesty International documents violence and discrimination from both population and authorities against LGBTI persons. As recent as June, we got documentation for violent attacks on trans women in Angola. So it's really important to see this from several sides, because of course legislation is really important, because that means that somehow you can hold authorities to account, or at least try to do that. But in most cases, LGBTI plus people face persecution and discrimination, including violence from both populations and authorities, including from their own families. There are so many countries that I could speak about, but I do want to say that also in Europe we see some really worrying trends going very fast in the wrong direction. I'm sure you can all remember some years ago when we started hearing about the persecutions in Chechnya, former member of the Soviet Union. This is something that is still going on. LGBTI people are still facing violence in Chechnya. At that time, Amnesty asked the Danish government to support and give refuge to some of these people. Unfortunately, we did not manage to get them to do that. Other places in Europe, even within the EU, we see massive pushes in the wrong direction. For example, Poland declaring LGBTI-free zones now in 80 municipalities and cities, but also other countries. Romania trying to narrow down the definition of marriage to only covering men and women. And in a lot of other countries, we unfortunately see the same things. So we also have a government now that has made it clear that supporting LGBTI plus persons and rights is a big priority for them within both their foreign policy and their development policy. So of course we hope that that will trickle down to other areas. The last thing I want to say is that it's really important also to create knowledge about both trans and intersex persons, and about both gender identity and sex characteristics as a means of seeking asylum. Because what we see in a lot of the documentation we make is that these are groups of people that are especially vulnerable to violent attacks from both authorities and populations, because their gender expression often falls outside the norms, gender norms. So just very important to look into these two specific groups. And also what we see is that there is a huge lack of knowledge about trans persons and intersex persons' rights, even within our own society. I mean, I could go on and on, but I think we should also let other people speak. So, thank you.
Thank you, Helle. Next panelist is Mads, who will tell us about the situation for LGBT plus refugees around the world, and also point to some of the solutions.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you. Let me start out by saying that in LGBT Asylum, we usually work with or for the rights and the conditions and the well-being, you can say, of LGBTI plus asylum seekers and refugees in Denmark. We provide various kinds of support and counseling and provide a social network, do various activities. So usually our focus with our activities and our advocacy also is on conditions in Denmark. But at the same time, we also experience, and we have experienced during the years, that many people, they write to us from around the world. LGBTI plus people or refugees, they around the world, they Google, find us, or they search on Facebook or whatever. And they write us emails or on Messenger where they tell about their desperate situation and where they ask us for help, basically. And there are, of course, limitations to what we can do. We can provide, some comforting words and provide some counseling and advice. But then some of them also say that, well, what you can also do is that you can help us by speaking our cause, creating awareness about our situation. So we also try to do that, and that's also part of the background while we're having this debate today. Then we also have a political debate, and I've had it in the last few years, about, that Denmark and other countries should mainly help refugees in the so-called nærområderne, the local areas, the neighboring areas to the countries refugees flee from. And we've had the discussion about whether or not Denmark should receive refugees via the UN resettlement program, flygtninge, refugees. And what we see when we look at all the inquiries that we get and all the messages that we get, we thought, well, okay, we have to do something about this. So we have looked into more systematic into all the messages that we have gotten, done an analysis of that and tried to compile it, and we have published this little note here some months ago, and that's what I'll talk about now, because what becomes apparent when we talk to people, write to people, listen to their stories, is that the conditions in these neighboring areas, I'm just saying neighboring areas as sort of the translation to what is often called nærområderne in Danish. What is really apparent and really obvious is that it's just not safe for LGBTI plus refugees in these areas, yeah. And it's also obvious to us that one of the solutions is to sort of make it easier and to create more capacity for resettlement as quota refugees. That's one of the solutions that we can see for LGBTI plus refugees that are in these conditions. But if I should say a little bit more about what people tell us, and we're talking about quite a few people. I mean, I think on average every other day someone from somewhere around the world writes to us and say, well, can you help us? And it's from literally around the world, from the neighboring countries to Syria, people in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran, Uganda, Kenya, all around the world. And they describe some quite distressing experiences and problems. We focus in this note here on the conditions for refugees, among other places, in a big refugee camp in Kenya called the Kakuma camp. We get many people that write us from this Kakuma camp, a big refugee camp in Kenya, where many LGBTI plus refugees are. It's a place where you can register for the UNHCR, and they've been told that you can get protection from the UNHCR there. But they describe, for example, that it's difficult for them to access the UNHCR or other humanitarian actors there. There's a lot of waiting time to get there. And often the offices, they are located close to, for example, the local authorities, the police, which they are, of course, not, they don't feel comfortable being there. We also experience that many people are not comfortable contacting humanitarian actors or the UNHCR. Just as another story, just last night, I was in dialogue with a young asylum seeker who was in Denmark, who wrote us on Messenger in an asylum center here, and he was very distressed and had a lot of anxiety, and I tried to encourage him to go and talk to the staff, the Red Cross staff in the asylum center. But he didn't do it, and he was afraid to do it. He didn't really trust them. And one thing is being an asylum seeker in Denmark, but imagine if you have been, if you are an asylum or a refugee from escaping, fleeing from, for example, Uganda, where you have experienced abuse, whatever, horrible persecution, and you get to Kenya, end up in the Kakuma camp, a country where being LGBT is also criminalized, where there are known accounts of authorities abusing whatever, also LGBTI plus people. There are known accounts of mob attacks, mob violence, both in the country but also in the camps. So many people tell us that they are afraid simply to contact the local staff working for the humanitarian organizations there. So that's of course also a big challenge. We also get accounts of sort of general conditions in the camps that are, that are overcrowded, with diseases, lack of hygiene, and where people live outside, or you cannot be on your own, you cannot close a door, which means that you're of course very vulnerable if you are, for example, LGBT+, and especially if you have a gender expression that differs from the norm. We get accounts that LGBTI plus refugees in these contexts, they face discrimination, threats, physical and psychological violence and abuse, rape, exploitation, blackmail, extortion, those kind of things. Let me just read a few of the messages that people write to us. So one writes, for example, I, as an LGBTIQ refugee and asylum seeker in Kenya, go through a lot. We are so much less privileged compared to other refugees. We are voiceless. The only hope has always been UNHCR and its implementing partners. But of recent, we have been so much ignored. The fact that we are LGBTIQ asylum seekers and refugees in a country that criminalizes homosexuality is more worrying. We are abused, blackmailed, raped, refused a chance to work due to the fact that Kenya doesn't recognize us, because it's illegal to be gay or to belong to any homosexual-related programs. Yeah. So people fear abuse, persecution from the other people, other refugees living in the camp. They also fear the reactions from the local authorities, from the UNHCR staff, and also from staff from other humanitarian organizations, yeah? Either because they have experienced negative reactions or because they simply fear it and do not contact them. Also, the local authorities and the police, they play a role, of course, in these camps because they have the authority to uphold the law and stuff. But these authorities, they are typically not comforting or reassuring for LGBTI plus refugees, on the contrary. Let me read just two other quotes from some of the emails and messages that we have received. One writes, "The Kenyan police are a particularly brutal force to me, and frequently beating and making humiliations, both physically and sexually. The police itself are responsible for much of the violence against me." And another one writes, "I've been assaulted on various occasions in various places elsewhere here in Kenya. I've been discriminated, blackmailed, and survived a number of death threats and sexual abuse, all because of my sexual orientation, and still there isn't any safe option by authorities rendered to me." So, I mean, we can just conclude that the conditions in these neighboring areas is not safe, yeah? And there's no quick fix, to solve that. So of course, it is necessary to support local communities and support refugees locally or regionally, but it's not just a solution in the short run for LGBTI plus refugees in these contexts because it's simply dangerous for them to be there. And one of the solutions for that would of course be to increase the possibility to get resettled via the UN as kvoteflygtninge. And we've had a discussion in Denmark recently about this. Denmark has opted out of the resettlement program for some years, but will now receive quota refugees again. Just last week, the Danish government announced that this year Denmark will receive 200 quota refugees. Early on, when Denmark received quota refugees, Denmark received approximately 500 a year. And that's of course a step in a negative direction, that you don't take on responsibility for what is happening. So we of course think that there's a much bigger need to include or to receive more quota refugees. And we also think it would be important to to remember the specifically vulnerable situation for LGBTI plus refugees in these contexts, and to also remember LGBTI plus refugees as one of the groups that should also be included in the quota that Denmark will receive. Yeah, I think that was my opening here.
Thank you very much, Mads, for really setting the scene and pointing towards the problem. I think it's it's really showing the magnitude of the problem that you're facing. And I'm quite shocking to hear that it's every second day that you actually receive some of these inquiries. Anna, you are a policy advisor for the Red Green Alliance. And now you have heard what kind of persecution that LGBTI plus refugees faces, and how the persecution often gets even worse when they get to the refugee camps or in the neighboring area. How do you think it's possible for us to support LGBTI plus refugees? What can Denmark even do in this case?
Well, first, can I just ask a question? Is there any organizations like LGBT Asylum other places in the world? Yeah, but it's your website or whatever that most people find, or just
Yeah,
curious.
I think we have a name that somehow is easy to find.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know that there's also others. Well, I think that in regards to this topic, I think there's 3 things that's important to address in the Danish context. First, of course, is the question of how many refugees that Denmark should welcome from the UN quota system. And hopefully everybody knows that in Enhedslisten or the Red Green Alliance, we're not really satisfied with 200. We know it's better than 0, but it's not nearly enough, and it's not nearly enough to match, I think, both our responsibility in a global crisis, but also our wealth and resources. We would like to take 2,000 refugees from the UN quota system, which I think also match our Scandinavian neighbors a lot more. And I think it's worth looking toward Norway, who have decided to receive 3,000, I think, with focus on LGBTQ refugees, which is an idea I can be really sympathetic to, but at the same time skeptical towards the government, who looks for refugees who are easy to integrate or who represents economic value of some kind to the Danish society, or Christian refugees, or whatever discussion that's going on. I think this picking and choosing is a really nasty tendency, and that it should be way more important to pick those with the greatest need of protection. And I think in the agreement paper between the government and the supporting parties, I think we've chosen women and children, and that we should look into whether LGBTQ people should be added to that list. I also think we need to talk about how LGBTQ people are treated within the asylum system in Denmark. And I think definitely we need to talk about how the rights and safety and health of refugees and asylum seekers all refugees and asylum seekers who come to Denmark, how their rights and health is affected by the current political climate, which is extremely nationalistic and anti-immigration. And I think that's maybe part of the reason why this topic doesn't get the attention that it deserves in Denmark. And by the way, congratulations with the nomination to Årets Laks. I think that is so well deserved, and I hope that it will contribute to bring some attention to this topic, also in relation to next year's World Pride, where we celebrate our diversity and tolerance and whatever towards LGBTQ people, but don't really care too much about those who are not born here.
Thank you. I was just wondering if either Helle or Mads could just maybe clarify for us what qualified to resettlement or to become a quota refugee?
Well, you can qualify if you are recognized as a refugee, meaning that you live up to the requirements that you find in the Refugee Convention. And they state that you are a refugee if you basically in your country of nationality, if you risk persecution on the grounds of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. Sort of the interpretation of this regulation or of the convention is so that LGBTI plus is recognized as being a particular social group, the membership of a particular social group, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So finally, I'll give the floor to you, Astrid. So what are your views on this matter? Do we have the capacity in Denmark to take more quota refugees? And what can we do, for instance, in Copenhagen, where you sit in the borgerrepræsentation, I don't even, the council, yeah.
Yeah. City council.
City council, yes.
I'd say. Yeah, first of all, thanks for setting this all up. It's a really important discussion. I think we can definitely handle more refugees in Copenhagen. One of the things that happened was that in, I think, 2015, when we had those large groups of people simply walking into Denmark, we set in place a pretty large refugee welcome program, integration program in Copenhagen. And then shortly after that, we suddenly had no refugees coming in. So we actually have quite a good capacity for receiving and integrating refugees. What we're seeing so far is that the integration programs are going quite well because we're actually doing integration policies and not assimilation policies. We're trying to support people in terms of finding permanent housing. We're helping them learn the language while at the same time getting to work at an actual Danish job, which means that they have a much larger chance of actually meeting other people. And we've also been having really tremendous support from large groups of Danish volunteers, local volunteers who wanted to support socially and like be more welcoming. So in that way, I would say Copenhagen is definitely ready for more refugees. Our main problem is finding permanent housing because due to the really low integration ydelse, integration benefits, seems like a backwards word in English, but the amount of money that you get when you're a refugee or an immigrant in Denmark, because the amount that you get is so low, it's really hard for us to find permanent housing for people that they can actually pay. So currently we have kind of a build-up of people who are living almost permanently in non-permanent housing and waiting for permanent housing because we're simply not able to find rents that are low enough, which is really saying something because we do have access to all of the low-income housing in Copenhagen. We are allowed to kind of like put people into these houses, but there's simply so few that have low enough rents. So one of the things we've been doing is trying to set up more collective housing so that refugees can live together with other refugees in permanent housing, also to make sure that those who get here without families are not as vulnerable to loneliness. And in that discussion, I was very aware of and also got a proposal through about it that LGBT refugees should be allowed to live with other refugees with an LGBT background, or at least with kind of LGBT open views. So now, if you're an LGBT person and you're starting to kind of get the support to get permanent housing, you can say it to the people working with it, and then they'll make sure that you're supported in that way, because we don't want this vulnerability from the kind of the areas that they fled from to keep going. And I think that's one of the ways in which we can help in Copenhagen. One of the things I've been discussing with LGBT Asylum before this, because they're really good at sending in like notes to politicians and going like, hey, you're discussing this. How about you have this opinion? One of the things they've been saying is that we should be aware of, or we should try to get more refugees with LGBT background to the larger cities instead of spreading them all over the country, because we have a better chance of building up an actual community. We have a stronger LGBT communities in the larger cities, and there's also kind of there's a possibility of actually getting a proper concentration. Because right now we have a hard time making these collective housing units for LGBT refugees because there's so few of them. But if Denmark kind of went up in terms of how many quota refugees we would take, and then at the same time made sure that every LGBT refugee that gets here goes to Aarhus or Copenhagen, these two cities would to a much larger degree be able to actually help the refugees build, not only get the help they need in terms of trauma and stuff, but also getting an actual community that can support them permanently. Yeah, so I think mainly our problem in terms of not being able to support more refugees is actually housing, which could be solved by simply not paying people so little. And then we could concentrate on like getting a supportive community and also making sure that the diversity that we're so proud of in Copenhagen, that it also extends to refugees. So we know that Copenhagen is also not completely safe for LGBT people or for people with an immigrant background. So completely, constantly working to build that safety is also kind of a constant job. Yeah, that was long, sorry.
No, it's fine, and especially because you gave many, I would say, concrete examples on how we can deal with this on a community passable, I can't pronounce that word right now, level. But no, thank you. So I want to open up the floor for questions, but just before that, I was wondering from listening to you, maybe especially Esther and Anna, so yes, we would like more quota refugees than the 200 we have, but how? So what's the strategy? So you had one quite concrete example of maybe adding into the forståelsespapir on who are most in needed of this, but otherwise could we strategize a little bit on how do we get the government to take more quota refugees?
Well, we need to apply more pressure, I mean, from the red parties. In the agreement paper, we didn't agree on a number for how many UN quota refugees we should receive, because we couldn't agree. So what it says in the agreement paper is that it's up to Mathias Tesfaye to decide, which I think is a really shit solution. And obviously we need, I think, to build a closer alliance in the supporting parties to put pressure on the government, because, yeah, they're going to be really hard to push on this one. Yeah.
And maybe also use, now I'm not just thinking out loud, maybe also use the fact that we have a government which supposedly is open for LGBTI plus persons and rights, to say, okay, we have a specific problem here. So it could also be a way of not just increasing the number within the 200 coming from this group, but make it to add up to the 200 or add on to the 200. So, but yeah.
Can I just,
yeah, come on.
One other thing that we're trying to do, like also on the strategic side, is we keep sending letters to the government saying that we want more refugees to Copenhagen. We did it as, I think the last time we did was in June. So kind of saying the Copenhagen City Council agrees that we could take more refugees, so please send them to us. And we've also in the past sent kind of worried letters going why is there no refugees coming in now? We're kind of waiting for them. We do have the capacity for them. So these things we're constantly trying to push from the local level as well.
Perfect. Would it even be possible to engage other city councils to do the same?
Other city councils are doing the same. I know that there's a current proposal in Albertslund Kommune, and other smaller municipalities are also working with it. But we don't have a group of municipalities working together to do that, no.
It could be some kind of a network, for instance. So yeah, Mads, you were.
Yeah, just saying that we of course also, I mean, it's a bit difficult, yeah, to push this agenda, but we of course also try and do what we can, and we of course, when we do a thing like this, we of course also push it to everyone, you know, literally, I mean, everyone in the, you know, in the parliament and stuff like that, and we go to a lot of meetings and, you know, very open to, you know, alliances and collaboration with various actors on various political levels, and yeah, I guess that's what we must try to strengthen somehow.
Do we have any questions from the floor, from the audience? Yes? I think you might get a mic so we can hear you.
Did you say 2,000 refugees in Norway? 3,000? And how many in Sweden?
I think in 2018 they took 5,000.
5,000?
Yeah, they went up from 1,200 to 5,000.
Helle, you wanted to ask a question?
I just wanted to ask LGBTI Asylum a question. If you can, like, besides the UN refugees, the people coming here to claim asylum, like, how many compared to, like, going a few years back? And if you see any trends in, you know, how easy or difficult it is to get asylum based on LGBTI plus status?
Yes, I think, I mean, we don't have any numbers of how many LGBTI plus asylum seekers are arriving to Denmark as spontaneous asylum seekers, as it's called when people come here on their own. But I think that we can say that the number of people approaching us is of course also influenced by the number of people coming in general. I mean, the number of asylum seekers coming in general, of course, relates to, you know, how easy or difficult is it to actually get access to a place where you can apply for protection, international protection and asylum, and it's gotten more and more difficult, yeah? So you see that also in Denmark, a lower number of asylum seekers coming, and we are also contacted by fewer than we were some years ago. There are still people coming, still people contacting us on a regular basis, but not as many as some years ago. And you asked about the conditions for it, and I think we can say that we also experience that it has gotten more difficult in recent years to get asylum, that the authorities, the immigration service, the refugee appeals board, they apply a stricter practice, I think you can say in some ways. So we find it that quite a few LGBTI plus asylum seekers, they are rejected because, for example, that the authorities do not believe that they're LGBTQ, or they don't believe that the persecution that people are facing from, for example, non-state actors, local communities, families, whatever, is severe enough. Yeah? So it's gotten tougher.
We have a question from the floor. Yes, please come on.
Okay. Well, yeah. I was just into a debate for like an hour ago, where Rasmus Prehn, the Minister of Development, talked about LGBT asylums in his work, and he actually said that he would talk to Mathias Fey about this, and he would be open to talk to LGBT asylum also, to get those stories and see if, well, yeah, to have a dialogue. And then I have a question to Astrid. You talk about that you have asked the government or said that Copenhagen would like more refugees. But is that possible, just to send more refugees just to one commune in Denmark, or do they have to, they have to be spread around the whole country?
There's two things about this. One of them is that the way they used to spread them out over the country, they looked at how many people with a non-Danish background was in the specific municipality before deciding whether to give any refugees to this municipality. So Copenhagen actually used to be like a zero quota municipality because there's so many like international workers here or people with an immigration background. There's like lots of different reasons for this. And then Copenhagen actively said to the government, hey, you're not giving us any refugees now, you're sending them to all the other cities, but we believe that we would be able to help some people here. So in that way, we started getting some refugees. What we're doing now in sending these letters to the government is mainly trying to push for them to take more, receiving more quota refugees. Yeah.
Thank you, and also a very good point on working together with the different ministers who are in this field. I just want to, I see we have more questions, I just want to pop one question because I would like to go to the country of origin and to the countries in the neighboring areas just for a second. Because two things came into my mind when hearing from you. One thing was you, Helle, saying that okay, we can change the law, but changing the attitude of the people in the country is really taking a long time. So maybe, and this is also where the development cooperation angle really comes into play, I would say. So maybe you could just take us a little bit through this. Are you doing any work in Amnesty on trying to change these attitudes, or how is your work on this?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we can just also look at Denmark as an example of that. Like one of my other topics that is close to my heart is changing the Danish rape legislation into a consent-based one. And, you know, even though the law changes, it will still take a very long time for attitudes to change. So everyone has the right to sexual and bodily integrity and autonomy. But yeah, we are working with LGBTI plus organizations in different places to try to change opinions and also to change laws. We have also been involved in a few court cases to argue against homophobic or transphobic legislation. Right now, very concretely, Amnesty Denmark is working with organizations in Uganda and will be for the next 3 years to educate politicians, police, lawyers, prosecution, other legal practitioners to be more LGBTI plus inclusive. And we will also slowly start to work a bit with them on the general public, but of course led by the organizations there and what they think will have the biggest impact and not create any kind of backlash. And of course, it's important that the Danish government supports LGBTI plus organizations as part of our development work around the world. But of course, it's also important to follow up with actions and actually protect the people who needs and has a right to be protected.
Yeah, I just want to add perhaps that I think there's also a responsibility that lies with the big humanitarian organizations that works in these contexts, that they also need to address this issue internally and externally. I mean, they must acknowledge the fact that there are some people, some LGBTI plus refugees that do not dare approach them because they are afraid to do so. That's one side of it. The other side is that they must also acknowledge that they are actually already providing services for LGBTI plus refugees, even though they might not see it, might not know it. So the local staff working in these organizations, they need to have tools, sensitivities, languages, whatever, to do this. And they also need to have some tools to perhaps reconcile whatever they might have of personal, religious, whatever political beliefs with their professional obligations. So there is an obligation there, I think, that the humanitarian organizations need to take on. And one way of doing it is, of course, also to align where there might be of local LGBTI plus groups or communities, organizations, because they're there if you just look for them.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. First of all, thank you all for your input. It's very interesting. I study social work, and particularly international and intercultural social work. And through my studies, I learn a lot about how difficult the integration and working process is in Denmark. And as far as I understand, like you said before as well, that it and negativity towards asylum seekers and particularly LGBTQI plus people. Yes, in Denmark.
Thank you for that question. I think there is a lot of myth busting to be done in regards to how integration is going in Denmark and how much it costs. The finance ministry has done some calculation on how much one immigrant costs, and I think there is a lot of there's reason to be really skeptical towards how those calculations are done. But the result is that they've painted a picture of how expensive it is to have people come to Denmark and how expensive integration is, which I think has been the ground from where they have built the whole paradigm shift that everyone who comes here is on a temporary stay. As soon as you can, you need to leave again. And in that state of mind, it's never going to make any sense. Like, we need to change that back. And I think of course it's going to be expensive to dehumanize people if you're going to keep them in camps, not let them live and work and educate themselves. Of course that's going to be expensive, and it's also going to break down people. But I think it's such a weird discussion to have this, and at the same time the discussion about pension and how we're going to be in need of a lot of hands on the labor market. I mean, there's a lot of hands that doesn't do anything right now, and if I think we're willing to invest in education and health, this calculation or this regnestykke, how do you say regnestykke? Calculation, would look a lot different. And I think Enhedslisten also pushes for that refugee council, is that flygtningenævnet? The refugee appeals board. That the Danmarks flygtningehjælp. The Danish refugee council is reinstated in the appeals board, so that it's not just the three judges, but there's also institutions and organizations that know about the actual conditions in the home country. So we don't see a case like Ayonin's, where she is sent back to Angola, where Amnesty's and others' critique is completely valid because the not the council, the other one, appeals board doesn't really know about the de facto conditions. So that's, I think, is another important step to make sure that these
Gotta be honest that I'm not very strong in this part because I'm mainly doing local politics. But I do think that we're also working on trying to make this process less of trying to prove someone wrong and more of trying to understand what is actually leading people to apply to get here. I think also in the discussion of the discussion about the near areas is also kind of relevant in this situation because while there's been a lot of talk about supporting in the near areas, there hasn't been that much actual money being posted into it. So a lot of even though there might be in theory a majority for helping more in the near areas, there isn't actually a majority for putting these money into it. But if we did that, then at least some of the pressure on quota refugees could be taken off, and then there would be probably a larger space for supporting some of those quota refugees that cannot be helped in the near areas, like LGBT refugees. That's kind of backward way, but.
Yeah, I think your question was something around also how do you change the discourse, sort of the political discourse in this area in Denmark, and that's of course very difficult. We also try to, but I think with a view to the fact that it is very difficult, I think it's also important to be aware that there's a big need to work perhaps also, or perhaps just as much, with empowerment and with inclusion. That means strengthening the networks, social networks for refugees in general, also LGBTI plus refugees. So I think one thing is trying to change the discourse. Another thing is trying to strengthen the groups, the networks, the inclusion for LGBTI refugees, and supporting them also politically, of course.
I just wanted to say that it's very inspiring to hear how we have municipalities that are doing activism on this topic.
Yes, for sure. We have one more question.
Thank you. This is a question about LGBT asylum seekers here in Denmark. There seems to be this pervasive idea in mainstream politics that if you open up for the opportunity for people to seek asylum,
as we see it, it's not a big thing as we experience it. We need to remember that it is very difficult also for people that come from settings where you have a history of profound homophobia, profound transphobia, biphobia, profound internalized homophobia, biphobia, etc. It's not that easy just to come out and pretend in a credible way that, oh, I'm so gay, you know. Of course it's difficult to assess this. It's also difficult for the authorities, and there will be, of course, also people trying to go about it. But we more often see the opposite thing, that people actually are not able to express and tell about their sexual orientation or gender identity in any way, or in any way that seems credible for the authorities, because they're afraid to do so. They don't have the language that is, expected. So we often see it the other way around. And then I think that we also, of course, have this principle that if you are in need of protection, you have the right to get it. Yeah, and that must be the basic principle. Yeah, so it's not okay if someone has the need and are rejected. That is the basic problem. Yeah, we don't see a problem that there are many coming, whatever. We see a problem that some that are in need of protection are not getting it. Mm?
That's a very strong point. I just want to see you, but I just want to read. We have a question from online. What are you doing for African LGBT refugees who find themselves in difficult situations to get themselves on your program? And I guess it's more directed towards you. Yeah, what you do. So what do you do? What are you doing for African LGBT refugees who find themselves in difficult situations to get themselves on your program?
Well, we don't do much directly to get them in our program, in the sense that our activities they are in Denmark. Yeah, we can directly help and support and provide services for asylum applicants and refugees in Denmark. So there are limitations to what we can do when people contact us. But we, of course, answer and we listen and we provide comforting and acknowledging words. And we can provide some information about and some advice about how to go about it if you want to apply for international protection or asylum somewhere where that is a possibility. What is it important to remember? You need to have a personal story of personal persecution. You need to bring the documentation, etc. And if you manage to get to a place where it's possible to apply for international protection, then you can do this and this. If you come to Denmark, you should go there. We would of course be able to help and assist you if you manage to get here. That's basically what we do. And then in some cases, not often, but we can of course try to see if there are any organizations or networks that we know of where people are. some time ago, for example, there was a lesbian woman in Somalia, for example, that wrote to us, and she was fleeing, on the run, afraid of her family and stuff. And then I was like, well, where are you in Somalia? And then she was like, well, I'm in this city. And then I checked, for example, the Danish Refugee Council I could see that they actually had an office and provided services and protection services for refugees in that city. So I wrote to her and say, well, you can perhaps try to approach the Danish Refugee Council, if you need a safe space. And then I could write to a person working in that office saying, well, I've talked to this woman, she might come to you, and they're like, okay, good to know, thank you. So we can try and establish local contacts, but most often they're not there, or we do not know of them, yeah? So, yeah, it would be nice that we were able to do more when people write us, but we can provide general information from a distance.
Yeah, because I was also just wondering, you gave the example before with someone too afraid to approach the Red Cross in the area, if it was possible more to go directly to these organizations, saying we have now received some inquiries on this camp. We know you have an issue. Could you please?
Yeah, and we of course also do that. I mean, also say that resettlement via the UN is a possibility. We could try to register with UN, try to apply that in that way, knowing that it's difficult and that there's a long waiting time. We're also quite honest and say to people that it's hard to apply for asylum. It's difficult to get asylum. So if there are any other options for you in relation to migration, check them out. Would it be possible to get a student visa, work visa, green card, whatever, because it is just difficult and hard to apply for asylum. And then, of course, unfortunately, most often, I guess, for people writing from various places in the world, I mean, they cannot just get a visa. But, yeah, we are honest.
My name is Janaba. I'm also part of LGBT Asylum. I just want to say to you, now I don't know if I can move around with the mic and I'm not allowed to touch. But you had that question, and I mean, we had an event this Monday from 7 till 8. I'm saying this because you can stream it online, where actually Maria from our group and Nicholas from our group had an interactive event with the theme, how do you prove you're gay? And if you go and check out that event, it will be very obvious how many questions in so many ways that people applying for asylum in Denmark based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity, that is really, really difficult, to answer all of those crossing questions. So I know that is also a discourse that some of the politicians actually do use, also on the very high minister level here in Denmark, that, it's so easy, or you could just, say that, you could lie about it. But I think if you actually check out that event, and we will be here for more questions, that is really, really, really difficult, just like Mads said, to actually lie about that.
Thank you for that recommendation to check it out. Do we have any more questions from the floor? No, it doesn't seem like it. Do any of you have any closing, burning remarks you want to give from this debate?
Not as such. I just want to say thanks a lot for your participation, that you came and were part of this panel. It means a lot to us, and thanks a lot to you that came also to be part of this today, and thanks to you that are watching the live stream, and also for the good question there.
Yes, then you took my final words, because I also just wanted to say thank you, but that's great. So we're all thanking, thank you for listening in, and I hope you walk away from here with both more insights on this issue, but also maybe more determination to actually go and support LGBTI+ refugees around the world. So thank you.